Thank you very much. Thank you for having me and for coming out this evening. Before I begin even to talk about what I'm going to talk about, I want to offer up a couple of pairings from 19th century political thought that lay out some of the contrasts that I was motivated to think about in the course of developing this project more years ago now than I care to think. That book really needs to be done quite soon now. One of the contrasts is between the English liberal John Stuart Mill and the French liberal Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville is perhaps most enduringly famous for his theory that American democracy was stabilized and showed signs of health and vigor to the degree that those things were true, in part because of the American habit for association. The Americans, unlike, he thought, the French of his own era, Tocqueville said, have learned to do things in voluntary groupings together. In an era of, as Tocqueville saw it, rising mass equality, an era when no one person would be able to accomplish the great things that an individual noble could have accomplished in centuries past. The French temptation, Tocqueville thought, was always and only to turn to the state in a way that he thought was deeply dangerous to the development and the maintenance of human freedom. But the Americans had worked out, through the art of association which they had cultivated and developed almost to the point of mania, they had developed the ability to do things themselves without constant recourse to state power. From that account in Tocqueville, we get, much later, flourishing studies of voluntary associations and civil society in America and then later elsewhere. Tocqueville, in his other great work, The Ancien Régime and the Revolution, studied the turn to centralization in French history, arguing that centralization was not a feature primarily of the Revolution. The Revolution merely culminated and completed the work that the Bourbon monarchs had been undertaking for some centuries before. But the completion in the Revolution was important. And Tocqueville said, in crucial ways, the pre-revolutionary French were freer. They were freer, although unequal, and holding unequal rights, because they were vigorous in defense of their corps intermédiaire, their intermediate institutions. The church, the self-governing city, the self-governing guild, the province, the university, the bar of attorneys. All of these, Tocqueville thought, in Ancien Régime France, had seen great, vigorous, local, communal activity. And in that vigorous activity, there had been an ongoing check on the ability of the Bourbon monarchs to do what they were trying to do, which was to reduce all of France to an absolute subservience beneath an absolute centralized monarchy. Because the French Revolution had abolished all of the corps intermédiaire, had destroyed their privileges, had replaced the provinces with administratively designed départements with which no one had any emotional attachment, had abolished the privileges of guilds and cities, and the self-government of the church, and so on. Tocqueville said, the Frenchmen of his era lacked that sense of independence, that sense of standing up for themselves, that their ancestors had had. In Tocqueville, in other words, a crucial part of a social theory of freedom is a theory of intermediate associations. Whether these are voluntary or feudal, whether they arise from below or by old legal habits, in either case, there's the possibility for people to lead lives that are not themselves directly dependent on the state, and therefore to help protect them from habits of subservience. Now, John Stuart Mill, Tocqueville's frequent correspondent and sometime friend, was also concerned with an era of mass equality, also concerned with how human freedom was going to survive in what they both thought of as the democratic age to come. Mill and Tocqueville both thought that they shared core moral concerns. But Mill's crucial contributions to the liberal theory of freedom include in On Liberty a defense of something like eccentric free thought against the conformist tide of Victorian public opinion. In On the Subjection of Women, an understanding that the Victorian family was a kind of local tyranny, and that the defense of women's equality was itself a defense of freedom, because the marriage law of late 19th century Britain subjected women to unfreedom. It deprived them of their legal ability to stand on their own 2 feet. Famously, in his marriage to Harriet Taylor, John Stuart Mill publicly announced that he forswore the use of, and if the law would permit him to, would utterly rid himself of, all rights and privileges that a husband might unequally exercise over a wife. Mill gave a rapturous review to democracy in America. He initiated correspondence with Tocqueville at that time. They wrote a great deal about their shared worries, their shared sensibilities about how human freedom would fare. When Ancien Regime came out, however, Mill sent a much more skeptical letter in private to Tocqueville. He said, in effect, "I understand that you like these things, these intermediate bodies, but surely you're taking it a bit far, and surely you are understating how truly awful all of those local, intermediate, unequal privileges were." And indeed, in his review of democracy in America, what looks most famous to posterity, the account of freedom of association, scarcely figures. Mill mentions it, but is not central to his understanding of what's going on in that work. For all of their areas of common interest, I think that Mill, in a strong sense, couldn't understand what Tocqueville was on about when he was talking about all of the non-state intermediate associations. And in Considerations on Representative Government, Mill offered a rival history of the development of freedom in Europe, a history in which the centralizing monarchs, the centralizing states of early modernity, had been a crucial force for freedom. Not because they didn't want to be despotic, but because, Mill said, obedience to a distant monarch is like freedom itself compared with subservience to a neighboring lord. The lord right here will demand personal obedience and subservience in a way that the distant monarch just doesn't care about. In turn, had Tocqueville lived to read Subjection of Women, which he did not, I think he wouldn't have understood that either. We get a sense of that in the chapters on democracy in America on the family in America. Tocqueville reports, and it doesn't matter for our purposes whether he's right about this, Tocqueville reports that women in America are much more conservative, family-oriented, and indeed subservient than women in France. Tocqueville occasionally caught the mood of his era, and there was a little bit of a panic about strange, loose women running around Paris. The American women, he thought, were so devoted to husband, household, and family that there was none of this. And they obeyed cheerfully. But what does Tocqueville say about this? Tocqueville, for whom obedience and subservience are all but swear words so often? He says, look at this high noble exercise of their freedom. They choose to marry, they choose to devote themselves to their families, and their obedience is voluntary obedience. Something that you could scarcely imagine him saying in Ancien Regime about the subservient habits of the French of his era. That's the Mill and Tocqueville contrast. Now also, I want to develop a brief contrast between Mill and Lord Acton, one of the great Whig theorists of the same era. Acton was a deeply committed federalist. He was strongly committed to decentralization and to opposition to strong centralized hierarchies. This was true in church life as well as in state life. In the years before the First Vatican Council, Lord Acton was one of the most important English Catholics in the fight against the turn to papal supremacy and papal infallibility. He wished to defend the autonomy of the national churches from Rome and to maintain the sense that the Roman Catholic Church was a federative body, not a monarchy. When he lost that fight, when First Vatican went the way that it did, he was a good enough Catholic, as it were, to keep his mouth shut about it for the rest of his life, but it was clear that he was displeased. In politics, his commitment to federalism was even stronger. He thought the American discovery of federalism was the most important contribution to the science of freedom in the modern era. And in an essay called On Nationalities, Acton directly rebuked Mill's embrace in on-representative government of the theory of nationalist self-determination, a theory which was greatly shaking the foundations of the continental European political order in that era. Mill had said, free people will want to join together with people like them, and by creating unified nation states, really they will enhance as well as living out their own freedom. Acton thought the doctrine of nationalism, which was going to break apart, say, the Austro-Hungarian Empire into a number of unitary nation states, was a terribly dangerous threat to human freedom. And that replacing the Austro-Hungarian Empire with a succession of unified, homogeneous nation states would lead to an excessive veneration of the state. Acton said, a plurality of nationalities in the same state, like a plurality of religions, stops people from worshiping the state because they don't invest their whole identity in it in a unified way. Now, it's been, I think, the normal reaction among at least a great many liberals in the 20th and 21st centuries, certainly since 1920 or 30 or so, to say that Acton looks pretty prescient about Eastern and Central Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not an attractive political order, but the nationalist excesses of the nation-states that followed it were surely worse. And as one looks around the world in the years since then, the drive to create more ethno-nationally homogeneous states has not tended to be a drive that was associated with the liberal sentiments of freedom that Mill foresaw. So Acton saw something I think that Mill did not, about keeping the state from being too emotionally central by preventing it from being nationally unitary. Acton's federalism allowed him to see farther. And yet Mill was one of the key figures in the fight within British liberalism to oppose the cause of the American South in the Civil War. Mill saw that human chattel slavery, as practiced in the American South, was a grave offense against human freedom, a constitutive offense against human freedom. And even though there was a natural alliance of economic interest between Britain and the South that provided its mills with cotton, even though there was a strong geopolitical commonality of interests, because the United States threatened British possessions in Canada, and a divided United States would surely have been to the advantage of Britain militarily. Nonetheless, Mill, among others, said Britain ought to remain firmly committed to not recognizing the American South and to, at least emotionally and morally, cheering on the cause of abolition, cheering on the cause of the North in the Civil War. Acton, by contrast, took up a correspondence with Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Southern armies, after the war ended. And Acton, a member of the British House of Lords, wrote to Lee, I mourn more for the stake that was lost at Richmond than I celebrate that which was defended at Waterloo. Acton thought the defeat of the South had destroyed the cause of federalism, and that Lincoln's centralism, Lincoln's urge to entrench the power of the central government over state-level autonomy, was wildly destructive of the future of human freedom and constitutional government. Acton, in his public writings too, treated 1865 and the end of the Civil War as a cause for great pessimism about the future, not just of the United States, but because the United States was in the vanguard of the theory of federal constitutionalism, as a reason to be pessimistic about the fate of human freedom altogether. Now, Acton didn't deny that slavery was wrong. In his pre-Civil War writings, while he reserved a special kind of venom for the Massachusetts abolitionists, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, he always said that slavery was itself a violation of natural right. But the abolitionists frightened him more than the slaveholders did. And the triumph of the North frightened him more than the triumph of the South would have. Why? Well, because Acton thought that the central state was the key threat to human freedom. And if it had to be the case in order to keep central states in check, in order to allow federal constitutionalism to limit central power, that some millions of human beings were held as property, well, that was unfortunate. But sometimes unfortunate things happen. I began this project with these pairings, saying, in effect, Mill, Acton, and Tocqueville all shared, more or less, a commitment to a liberal theory of freedom. They were all self-identified liberals in politics. We, in retrospect, treat them all as liberals in the history of political thought. They all said that they were committed to freedom as an ultimate human end. None of them were, for example, theorists who substituted equality or solidarity or order or religion, or as the Canadians have it, peace, order, and good government, for the fundamental end of human liberty. And yet, Tocqueville couldn't see what was oppressive about the family. Mill couldn't see what was interesting and potentially protective of freedom in the voluntary association. And Acton couldn't see that the South was wrong in the Civil War. And I wondered, as it were, why all of this was. The book develops an account of two understandings of threats to freedom that run through the history of liberal ideas and liberal political and social thought today. I call these pluralist and rationalist. The pluralist school within liberalism sees in the proliferation of intermediate entities, non-state groupings all through society, churches, cultural groups, voluntary associations, local levels of government, provincial levels of government, and a federation, sometimes the family. They see there the sites where free people lead their complicated, diverse, separate lives. What we do with our freedom is we come together and form groups in which we can do things. And moreover, the pluralist school sees the intermediate bodies as bulwarks of freedom that help us protect ourselves against the power of the central state, a power that has become otherwise irresistible over the course of modernity. The rationalist school, by contrast, looks at this proliferation of social bodies outside the state as being a proliferation of possible sites of local tyranny. Each of these has power within it. Each of them has rules and procedures that can unfairly constrain their members. And the rationalist liberal hopes that a rationally directed modern state can check and limit and abolish all of that local despotic power. Sometimes this takes the form of a demand that intermediate bodies be themselves local liberal democracies, so that there shall be the same rights as against an association or a church or a family or a cultural group that there are against the state. The rationalist liberal says, we think the free person is free to speak. That grounds our defense of freedom of speech against the state. But our commitment is to people being free to speak. And if we live in a society in which, while the state respects freedom of speech, everyone lives their whole lives inside communities that tell them they may not speak freely, then we haven't really lived up to our aspiration to individual human freedom. About the tension between the rationalist and pluralist traditions within liberalism, I want to say the following things. One is, it is not a philosophical difference, not at its root. This is not an argument about what counts in the definition of freedom. There have been, I think, people who've noticed something like this tension and sought to reduce it to that. We have different people using the word liberty in different ways. We have some people who use the word liberty to oppose coercive orders, and some people who use the word liberty in a broader cultural way. And what we have, therefore, is something like a conceptual misunderstanding that one side could eventually win when we get around to getting our concepts right. That, I think, is false, and I'll say more about why. Second thing I want to say is that the tension between pluralism and rationalism within liberal thought, or within, if you like, a theory of human freedom, is irresolvable. We're stuck with it. We're stuck with it not because there are never right answers in particular cases. In what I had to say about Mill, Tocqueville, and Acton, I expressed a series of judgments that said Mill was right about the family, Tocqueville was right about the association, Acton was wrong about slavery. But because the right and wrong answers aren't all going to line up on one side, and the reasons why the rationalist and pluralist traditions endure in the theory of human freedom are not neatly mutually exclusive. We can't end by putting all of the pieces together in a harmonious, synthesized way and saying, here's the correct, complicated view of human freedom that will give us the formula into which we can plug some new dispute. So when we face some new question, is it the case that Islamic laws about the veiling of women impair the freedom of women in non-Islamic societies, in Western societies? It's a claim that is made in anti-veiling rules, not only in France, but also in the Netherlands, which has a stronger commitment to something like a liberal theory of freedom of religion, I think, than France does. There's one liberal answer that says individual freedom means freedom of religion. Almost before it means anything else, it means freedom of religion. And the freedom to practice one's religious ways, however conservative and constraining those may be, that is human freedom being exercised. What does the other side say in a moment like that? Because I think that we're not faced with a philosophical dispute over the meaning of freedom, I think that what the other side is saying is not, no, conceptually, it doesn't matter that that a church is not a state, since a state couldn't pass a law requiring women to be veiled, neither can a religious community have an internal rule requiring women to be veiled. You will hear that talk. It's conceptually confused, it is incoherent, and demonstrably, I think, incoherent very rapidly, but it's not the most interesting or persuasive thing that the rationalist liberal has to say. The most persuasive thing the rationalist liberal has to say is, when we see women being veiled, we are often confronting the visual expression of a kind of internal tyranny, internal to the family or internal to the religious community. We cannot simply assume that we are faced with a woman freely choosing. And sociologically, what we think we see is women who are not freely choosing, who are threatened by, indeed, violent power that is invisible to the state if the state lets it be. This claim was documented controversially but at some length in the Stasi Commission report that recommended the prohibition of the veil in schools in France in the early part of the 2000s. The claim was made that girls who did not wear the veil, and by the veil I'm sweeping under the carpet all of the distinctions among degrees of veiling, though they matter here. The difference between a full chador and a headscarf are dramatic. But in the French account, girls who did not wear any kind of veil, if the schools allowed veiling, were subjected to violent pressure from their brothers, from their fathers, from their schoolmates. If the brothers didn't beat up the girl for not wearing a veil, then the brothers themselves would be subjected to external pressure from their Muslim classmates until the brothers caved in and started exerting pressure on the sister to wear the veil. That, in other words, by prohibiting the veil in the school, the French state was freeing the girls from an exercise of internal local power. Whether that's sociologically right or wrong, it is not some exotic definition of the word freedom to think that, given those facts, it would be a kind of defense of freedom to intervene in that way. Because local power can be real power. It can be, though it needn't be, violent power. But when it is violent power, we get especially sharp exemplars of the problem. So if I'm right, the tension between pluralism and rationalism is deep and fundamental and irresolvable. When a new question like that arises, we are going to have to sort things out on a detailed, facts-on-the-ground, sociological kind of way. Some of the ideas that motivate each of these traditions in liberal thought are ideas within social theory, not ideas within moral philosophy, not ideas within a philosophy of rights, but accounts of where power comes from and what power is likely to be abused. Mill's claim about the local lords, like Acton's account of the central state. These were predictions that says power that's vested there is especially dangerous. Not philosophically different, not legally, utterly, categorically different, but especially likely to be abused in various ways, or especially likely to entrench itself. The pluralist tradition tends to see the proliferation of intermediate bodies as being the relatively spontaneous creations of complex pluralistic human societies. We want a variety of things in a social order. And we want to be able to pursue a variety of ends. And so we come together, or we remain where we are if we were born into one social spot rather than another, in order to make possible the living by rules that we choose. A group or an association or a religion or a university or all the rest are systems of rules. They're rules that we agree to follow in common and procedures that we agree to in common for the adjudication and the reform of those rules. They are prohibitions on some kinds of activity and requirements of others. You will not plagiarize, you will turn papers in, you will not have abortions, you will take communion, you will not eat pork, you will wear a veil. Or indeed for voluntary associations, you will contribute to the common enterprise of the association. Often for voluntary associations, you will not disclose an excess of information about the association to outsiders. Those systems of rules the pluralist liberal sees as spontaneous emanations of the things we are trying to do in our lives. And the pluralist liberal sees the state as being, sociologically, an entity that is likely to overreach. An entity that has imperatives of its own to seek power, and imperatives of its own to distrust intermediate groups. Why does the state distrust intermediate groups? Well, intermediate groups have secrets. Sometimes the state doesn't even know whether the intermediate group has secrets or not, but states are, among other things, information-seeking enterprises. The census is one of the first acts of the modern state, because the state that wishes later on to tax and to conscript first has to know who its people are and where its wealth is. Along with the census, the political scientist James Scott has persuasively argued the map, the cadastral map that shows the whole countryside in neatly taxable parcels, that shows the tax agent who visits a village where things are. The map and the census are information gathering tools. They allow the modern state to become the kind of thing that it is. And the intermediate association is partly constitutively a way of keeping information away. This is obviously true for groups with overt commitments to secrecy, ranging from the Freemasons to, say, the Roma ethnic minorities. It's obviously true for any minority that is defined linguistically. States hate language minorities because they don't know what's being said about them. But I think it's true really pervasively. Intermediate bodies have wealth. They have property. Since even before the modern state became recognizable as the modern state, we've seen recurring moments when centralizing monarchs and then later centralizing states would more or less declare war on one kind of intermediate body or another in order to seize their stuff. From the French kings and the Rosicrucians, I can never say that word right, in the 13th century, to Henry VIII's looting of the monasteries, to the French Revolution's looting of the monasteries, to the new Italian state's looting of the monasteries at the end of the 19th century, to the suppression of the Jesuits and the Freemasons in one place after another in the 18th and 19th centuries, to expulsions of the Jews. States look at discrete groups that they could get a hold of and say, there's stuff there. And states, in addition to being information-seeking enterprises, are wealth-seeking enterprises. Intermediate associations also teach habits about structures that states worry about. James I said of Presbyterianism that it was as compatible with life under a monarchy as God is with the devil. People who, in their church governance, are used to dealing with one another in a relatively equal way rather than the hierarchical way associated with the episcopal structures of Catholicism and High Church Anglicanism, those kinds of people will not be good subjects of a monarchy. A thought that was to gain further traction after the Calvinists got around to cutting off a king's head. In the 18th century, the Freemasons got hit with this from both sides. When one became a Freemason, one abandoned social rank at the door. And so it looks to a monarchy and an aristocracy like this is a world in which commoners can stand above nobles. Congregants can stand above priests. In those Freemason lodges that admit women, in which women can stand above men. However, the Freemasons, having checked status at the door, were not then robustly internally egalitarian. They had a strongly hierarchical, as they understood it, meritocracy. One advanced through the ranks. And so one found that democratic Republicans also distrusted the Masons. The Masons looked like little creations of little monarchies and created power centers such that grand masters could presumably be ordering their members what to do. Because the internal structure doesn't mirror the structure that the state envisions for relations between elites and others. States think people are going to learn bad habits that will make them unsuitable to be citizens of whatever our public order is. States, moreover, tend to overreach against intermediate groups because of the kind of power that states have at their disposal and who it is who is attracted to the use of that power. Adam Smith, in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, said the following: "The man of system, on the contrary, is apt to be very wise in his own conceit." One of my favorite phrases in all of Smith. "And is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely and in all its parts, without any regard either to the great interests or the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it." Smith was one of the first serious sociologists of the modern state. I think that Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations is one of the first serious modern pieces of political science that we have that sees the modern state in all of its complexity. And Smith understood that state power is a kind of abstract power, and it could appeal to a certain temperament and mindset that liked to rearrange society, as it were, according to straight lines. And that this would encourage an unhealthy, unattractive kind of state overreach. Now, there are equivalent problems elsewhere in society. I call the counterpart concept to the man of system the problem of the busybody. Local kinds of power are especially attractive to those who know their neighbors or know their fellow members and really relish the opportunity to tell them what to do. I don't know the rules about homeowner associations in Britain. I don't know how common they are. But in the US, condominium boards, it seems to me, have a selection effect of the same kind. Who are the people who want to spend their evenings over and over again meeting to handle the political problems of their condominium association, of their homeowner association? The people who really like telling their neighbors what to do, and who really like picking a fight with one neighbor or another and lording it over them. Saying, if you make me unhappy, you don't get to paint your house. The busybody relishes in-person power. The man of system relishes abstract, distant, uniform patterned power. But if the state attracts the man of system, as Smith thought, as Montesquieu thought, then in a contest between intermediate associations and the state, says the pluralist, we shouldn't expect the state just to be aiming at right answers. We should expect rather the state is going to excessively seek to crush and subvert intermediate groups in an unjust way. Now, the mention of Smith, combined with the audience that I have here, requires me to go through a little detour here. The ideas of spontaneous pluralistic social orders are familiar to many people through the work of Friedrich Hayek. The idea of the man of system sounds an awful lot like Hayek's portrait of the egotistical economic planner who thinks he's going to have more information than he can possibly have. Hayek thought that the price system, as well as the general process of human social evolution, allowed spontaneous, unplanned developments in economics, but also in politics and crucially in law, as we evolved social orders of our own according to, as he put it, quoting from Adam Ferguson, human action, but not human design. That familiarity with Hayek and the association of the man of system with the economic planner is potentially misleading. I argue in the book that the questions of economic planning and economic distribution that have divided liberalism primarily in the 20th century between a classical market-oriented liberalism and so-called new liberalism, as it's called in Britain, or social liberalism, or welfarist or redistributionist liberalism, that division cross-cuts the division between the pluralist and the rationalist. It is not just the case that the problems of state planning that the classical liberal complains of with respect to the economy are the same kinds of problems as those complained of by the pluralist faced with the rationalist state. There are areas of overlap. The concern about information and local knowledge is an area of overlap. However, Adam Smith, notwithstanding his critique of the man of system, was fundamentally, as a social theorist, in my terms, a rationalist. When he looked around the Britain and France of his era, he saw great abuses of local power. He saw a master and apprentice guild system that was deeply exploitative of the apprentices and that kept workers from being able to freely sell their labor at high wages. He saw guild systems that were oppressive of outsiders, forbidding entry into new markets. He saw privileged monopolistic state corporations like the British East India Company being deeply destructive of the British constitutional order. And in France, he saw the patchwork of cities and provinces and noble terrains, each with their own tax and regulatory status, as being destructive of the ability of France to come together as a unified market. Smith celebrated the commercial society of 18th century Britain. He thought that it was deeply good for post-Union Scotland. But it was not long before Smith's lifetime that state power extended into Scotland for the first time and successfully militarily defeated Highland invasions. And Smith didn't look at the Highland clans and say, oh look, attractive local spontaneous social organization. He thought if we are going to live freely, we need to live freely under the auspices of a state that has sufficient power to keep all of these dangerous little local actors in check. Now that's one-sided. Smith is complicated. There's a lot in Smith. His defense of religious freedom in the emerging urban environments has a more pluralist cast. But when it came to questions of state organization and state power, Smith fundamentally thought that the local actors could be destructive of the economic order that he thought was going to be good for us in the long term. The market was a rational order, one in which the same laws would apply to all, one in which rights would be transparent from one to the next. The castrato map that I said James Scott complained of as a founding act of the modern state, the dividing up of the countryside into transparent, recognizable pieces of individuated property, is an idea that today is associated with the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto, an important market liberal thinker who says the problem of poverty in the developing world is importantly because the poor lack clean title to neatly differentiated pieces of property which they can then mortgage and sell. This view, I think, is importantly different from the market liberal view developed by Elinor Ostrom and her students. A view that says property regimes, too, have spontaneous social difference. And rules of property, like any other part of an economic and legal order, will have local pluralistic variation. People work out for themselves what the rules are that work well for them in one environment or another. And the idea of overlaying the whole system with a rationalized property system of straight lines and individual parcels, says Ostrom and her students, is destructive of the relevant order. So even though De Soto and Ostrom are both, as it were, market liberals, they fall, it seems to me, on opposite sides of a pluralist-rationalist difference when it comes to questions of social order. And the same is true on the redistributionist or welfare or new liberal side. The book engages in a great deal of archaeology of the modern state, intellectual archaeology. What was the state like? What did it coalesce out of? The reasons why the rationalist-pluralist tension runs so deep in liberalism is because liberalism, I think, is an idea within the modern state, within the state that coalesces in Europe roughly in the 16th century, a little bit earlier in France and England, but not fully so. Liberalism is an idea about how to use and when to use and under what constraints to use state power. Now, the state that consolidates in early modern Europe comes into being in a world that's already thick with social institutions. From the 11th century onward, Europeans had founded universities, cities, guilds, monasteries, had brought the Catholic Church together as a unified corporate entity that transcended all of Western Europe. The state came into being and eventually consolidated their political organization into provinces that corresponded in part with linguistic and cultural differentiation. So the states that came into being faced pluralistic orders under them. And the state was born struggling against these pluralistic orders, seeking to centralize information, manpower, money, and jurisdiction and authority from all of these other entities. And this process is ambiguous from the perspective of freedom. It is not as though feudalism was a deeply liberal, individualistic world order. On the other hand, there were pieces and patches of the medieval world order that were highly individualistic and liberal, chiefly the cities. And the state's increasing concentration of power as it successfully defeated its intermediate rivals created something new in the world. Something new that, when it came time to threaten individuals directly, might do so without any barriers if it had successfully destroyed its intermediate rivals. It seems to me, by the way, that that ambiguity about state power is also one of the sources of the liberal division about economics. We are accustomed to thinking of states and markets as something like opposites. But the modern state is, in part, a credit-seeking device. The modern state that really coalesces in its fullest form in the Netherlands, in Britain, and then in France, is the kind of thing that can access capital markets on an international bond market that the Netherlands initiates. The financial revolution of the Netherlands and then of London was not destructive of state power in the Netherlands and Britain. It was greatly conducive toward it. And the story of the British-French rivalry in the 18th century was a story of France struggling and failing to catch up in the international capital market, struggling to be a credit-worthy borrower in the way the Netherlands and Britain had created themselves to be. The military power, the political power of the central state was always constrained by the bond market, by the need to be dependent on international finance. What it is to be credit-worthy is to be subject to the constraints of what lenders think is credit-worthy. And so you don't get to do just anything. But if you follow the rules, you get to do a great deal more than your rivals, and the Netherlands and Britain become tremendously economically powerful on the basis of the financial revolution. Again, an aside about economics, but just to say the patterns of complexity about what the relationship of the state is to freedom aren't unique to the problems that I'm confronting here. So if the account that I'm offering is right, if pluralist and rationalist liberalism, if the tradition that runs from Montesquieu through Benjamin Constant to Tocqueville to Figgis, and the tradition that runs from Voltaire and the Philosophes through de Soto de Tracy and the Ideologues, and to Thomas Paine, through to John Stuart Mill. If these are divided by competing assessments of where social power lies and where it is most likely to be abused, then we cannot expect resolution. Because it is a true thing in the world that states and groups alike can threaten freedom. And it's a sometimes thing about which of them will do it more. Indeed, which of them will do it more will partly be an effect of what we've decided at an earlier time about whether to protect groups or invade them. And so we're going to be left, I think, without the resolution that some of the earlier generations of liberal thinkers had hoped for. We will not find in the end that federalism is simply and straightforwardly an institution that favors slaveholding, or simply and straightforwardly an institution that enables free persons to live under constitutional government. The same will be true of radical religious freedom. The same will be true of respect for cultural minorities and their various practices, and for freedom of association, urban self-government, university self-government, and so on. We'll be left over and over again having to decide for ourselves, where here does power lie? Which threats to freedom are the graver ones? Without the ability to read one of those sets of answers out of a full story of human freedom. But recognizing that for us, as for those liberal thinkers of the past who I named, our ability to see one kind of threat to freedom clearly might well blind us to the other. The better we are, in other words, at seeing when states threaten freedom, it might be that the worse we are, like Acton was, like arguably Tocqueville was, at seeing when threats to freedom come from the other direction, and vice versa. Greater knowledge, greater sophistication here will not necessarily mean more right answers more of the time. That is a kind of intellectually pessimistic answer, but if I'm right and the world is as complex as I think that it is, it's the only answer that could possibly allow us to really move forward in the direction of greater freedom. Thank you.